Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Amber Arellano. I'm the Executive Director with the Education Trust Midwest. We are a nonpartisan research and advocacy and technical assistance organization really focused on improving education for all Michigan children, especially Michigan's most vulnerable students, African American, Latino, Native American, low-income children, and children with disabilities. As the Michigan and the nation continue to grapple with the ongoing devastating impact of the coronavirus, we're really pleased to share with you today our State of Michigan, our annual State of Michigan Education Report, which we do every year around this time. This year, we found it difficult because of the pandemic to report on metrics that we share every year on how we're doing toward our state's collective goal in becoming a top 10 education state for all groups of children. And due to the pandemic, we were not able to get, as many of you know, a lot of the data that we would normally report on. Without state assessments from last spring, we don't know how kids are doing in many ways, and we don't have access to the kind of information that we would normally benchmark against. So this year we wanted to dig into other kinds of data, and it felt like it was the right time really to check in with Michigan families, particularly parents who have been working so hard through the pandemic to educate their children, often under really tough conditions through many months of virtual learning. So this month and today we're releasing this report called The Urgency of Now, Michigan's Educational Recovery. We're pleased to bring together today very respected partners, business and civil rights leaders, as well as polling and data and research experts on this topic. We'll be reviewing the results of a new parent poll by our partner, New York-based Global Strategy Group. We'll highlight some findings of parent focus groups that have been conducted over the last few months by another partner, Early Works based in Detroit, which has been doing focus groups of diverse parents around the state, rural, urban, African American, Latino, English language learner, parents of English language learners, parents with children with disabilities, suburban parents, and low-income parents. We wanted to make sure that we were really hearing the voices of a diverse cross-section of parents across the state that really reflect all of Michigan for this report. And their voices are also lifted up throughout the report. And all of this, the data, the listening that we've done in the recent months has all really underscored the critical need to invest in public education, and particularly to prioritize the needs of underserved students. We know that based on a growing body of national research, that these are the groups of students that have been hardest hit by the pandemic. All of the most recent data released in recent weeks has also underscored that need. So today we'll be talking about that. We'll be sharing recommendations that are solution-oriented and research-based on what could our educational recovery look like? What are parents saying that they need at this time? What are parents supportive of in terms of educational recovery efforts? And so just to underscore a few things before we start, first that a kind of a extraordinary majority of parents, more than 80% of parents, said that Michigan needs a plan for educational recovery. There was also a significant majority of parents that highlighted the need for investment in things like high dosage tutoring and optional free summer school for families that of children who have fallen behind grade level expectations. These are very high percentages. Frankly, it's surprising how high the percentages are. And so we thought that was some really important findings to share with you today. We know that gaps between student groups are not only the result of the pandemic, but they're also the result of long-standing opportunity gaps, structural barriers that have been in place in our state for a long, long time. We know that the realities of COVID-19 and Michigan's historic educational inequities have predictably impacted students unevenly, and that COVID is exacerbating those disparities and gaps. And as an organization that's been really focused on making Michigan a top 10 education state, for us, you know, it's important that, and wonderful to see that educators are being prioritized for vaccinations, and that to see the governor and Republican state legislative leaders encouraging schools to reopen and to welcome kids back to in-person instruction by March 1st. But we know those are really the first steps in an educational recovery process. And it's really going to take a few years to recover from this process. Schools and districts need support, and they need resources to put quality plans into place for this summer and this fall. And those budget decisions are being made in the coming weeks. So we want to talk about those decisions and talk about the importance of the near and the far agenda for improvement. We don't want to lose that in sight of the immediate needs of kids and the immediate crisis ahead of us. So with that, I want to introduce the Education Trust Midwest Chief of Staff, Mary Greck, who will be joining us in this conversation. We'll also be joined in our discussion by Mike Jandernoa, founder and chairman of 41 North Partners in West Michigan, and a terrific civic and business leader who has become such a powerful and important voice for equity in our state, and Alice Thompson, the CEO of Black Family Development Educational Services in Detroit and chair of the NAACP Detroit Branch Education Committee, also the retired CEO of Black Family Development Incorporated, and as many know, a deeply respected civil rights leader across the entire state, and a wonderful partner in the work toward educational equity and justice. So with that, I would like to turn this over to Maura Farrell. She is with Global Strategy Group, and she will be sharing the polling findings today.
Good afternoon, everyone. Is everyone able to share see my screen? Great, fantastic. Okay, I'm going to try to get through these poll findings really quickly, but there will be time to go through and ask questions afterwards. I work for Global Strategy Group, and we've conducted over a dozen polls on the impact of the pandemic on children and families, from everything from early education to higher ed. But one of our main focuses has been talking to parents of public school children. So I'm really excited to show you the results of this poll that we conducted in Michigan. Before I get started, I get a lot of questions about how we conducted the poll, especially since it's really important to make sure that our sample is representative of all of Michigan. The way that we did that is we conducted the survey online, so we were able to reach participants across smartphones, tablets, and desktop computers. That really allowed people who may not even have a stable internet connection to participate in the poll. The poll was conducted in December, just before the holidays, so this is relatively fresh data. And we were able to reach 39% of participants who have a household income of less than $50,000 per year, and 24% of parents who identify as people of color. The way that we came up with our category for how we could create a representative sample was based on data from the National Center for Education and Statistics. They have really fresh, accurate data about what public school parents look like. So we used that to set our targets for the survey and ensure it was representative. So there are a few things that really stood out to us in the data. The first is that 85% of parents in Michigan have at least one child who is participating in remote learning. That's a really high number. And parents have concerns about how this is working for them. Number one is academics, including advancing to the next grade level, graduating from high school, and being ready for college and careers. Those are really top of mind for Michigan parents. Another really concerning thing that we see in the data is that parents of color are much more likely to have a child that is remote learning full time. 81% of Black parents say at least one of their children is full-time, compared to just 63% of white parents. So that's a really big gap that stands to worsen longstanding longstanding inequities in educational offerings unless that's addressed. So what I'm going to talk you through for this presentation are some areas for improvement and recommendations for state leaders moving forward based on our data. So the areas I'm going to cover in this presentation are extended learning time, addressing learning loss, improving virtual instruction, increasing digital access and the digital divide, and expanding access to childcare and preschool for Michigan families. So I'll start with our main recommendations for state leaders. This addresses extending learning time, but some other areas as well. We really see a high level of agreement in the survey, and Amber mentioned that at the beginning. I've talked to a lot of my colleagues over the past weeks and months about what a divided country we're living in. Michigan parents are not divided in terms of their priorities for education, and that comes throughout a bunch of different points in the data. Michigan parents agree that state leaders should have a plan to address learning loss and make sure students catch up to their current grade level. 86% of parents agree with that. 84% agree that state leaders should set quality standards for virtual learning in the state to ensure students who remote learn are receiving quality online instruction. And 83% agree that if it is safe to do so, state leaders should provide safe, free, and voluntary in-person summer school for students that need to catch up. I mentioned at the beginning that parents' #1 concern with remote learning is their child falling behind academically. This is a concern across the board, but there's a real difference if you look at the data between white parents and Black parents. 91% of Black parents are concerned compared to 83% of white parents. So it's a really elevated concern for Black families in Michigan. A big problem with this is that parents don't actually know if their child is suffering from learning loss or not. 47% of parents say that they have received little or no information about whether their child has suffered from learning loss or has fallen behind grade level expectations. 47% is a good number if you're trying to win an election. It's not a good number when you're talking about who's received information. It's less than half. That's not where we want to be, and that's a big area for improvement. In terms of remote learning specifically and how it's going, we asked parents to rate how successful they thought it was going on a 0 to 10 scale. When we're using that type of scale to know it's going really well, what we really want to see is numbers that are 8, 9, or 10 out of 10, and only 37% of parents make it into that category, which means almost 2/3 of parents give it middling or low ratings. It's not all doom and gloom. There are some good things about how this process is going. 40% of parents say their ability to support their child's education is better than it was before the pandemic. And another 40% say that their child's ability to learn at their own pace has been better. Those are the things that are going well, but there are a lot of things that are distinctively worse. The 4 top areas are one-on-one time with teachers. 54% of parents say this is distinctively worse than before the pandemic. 52% say their child's overall educational experience has been worse. Engagement and interest in schoolwork is worse. And parents also believe that the quality of teaching and instruction that their child receives is worse than before the pandemic. Digital access is another really important component of this. There are a few different ways that we try to measure how things are going. What we did here was we asked, we gave people a bunch of things that schools could do to help parents during this time, and we asked them if they thought that would be helpful for them or for families like them. And then we followed up and asked, is this something that your child's school is actually providing? So looking at the gaps there to see how things are going, and then in certain places we've been able to track that progress over time. We asked about lending mobile devices. 96% of Michigan parents say this would be helpful, and 62% say their school is currently providing this. That's actually a pretty good number, but it can certainly be higher. 1 in 3 families don't access this benefit. And among those who do, I've heard stories of people having to wait a really long time to get the devices that they need or have to share them with siblings. 88% of parents say providing free internet access would be helpful. I know this is a hard ask, but it's something that would really make a difference to families, and just 1 in 5 Michigan families are able to access this benefit right now. A safe place to do schoolwork and participate in remote learning is another thing parents overwhelmingly say would be helpful, 86%, and just 1 in 4 at 26% are able to access this right now. And there's a big divide on race in terms of who is actually being able to do this. It's provided to 18% of Black parents and 28% of white parents. That is a pretty significant difference. In terms of internet and trying to quantify just how big this problem is for parents, we asked parents if they were concerned about affording their internet or losing their internet access. 62% of parents who have a household income of less than $50,000 say that this is concerning. And notably, more than a third of parents in the higher income bracket say this as well. So even some of the more affluent families in the state are concerned, and certainly their financial situation could change at any time right now. The last area I'd like to go through with you all is early childhood education. We focus this poll on parents of public school students, but certainly parents have an understanding of what this was like with when their children were younger, and there were a good section of participants in the poll who actually have younger children right now. We asked parents if they supported Michigan investing more public funds. We made it very clear in the question wording that this meant spending money in expanding access to quality, affordable child care and preschool for Michigan families with young children ages 0 to 4, and overwhelmingly across race and income, parents support this at 91% overall. So that's a really astonishing number and a very strong consensus from Michigan parents. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Mary.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining in today. Thank you, Maura, for sharing those interesting findings. I will be providing an overview of some of the recommendations and findings from within our report, and do want to note that if you have questions for myself or for Maura or the panelists who will speak after me, you're welcome to enter those into the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. So in this year's report, we know that the nation and our state is continuing to grapple with the ongoing and devastating impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we know that it could be easy for the long-term vision of improving equity and excellence in Michigan's public education system to get lost in the efforts to address the urgent crises and the immediate needs of students and families right now. However, we know that doing so would be a travesty for Michigan students, especially low-income students, students of color, English learners, and students with disabilities who have been underserved by our public education system for decades. So meeting the needs of our students will really require us now to focus on both the immediate needs and addressing the longstanding inequities. In our report, The Urgency of Now, we call on state leaders to embrace a vision of hope and adopt research-driven and proven strategies that will really help Michigan recover lost learning from the pandemic, but also work towards becoming a top 10 state for our nation. And specifically, we build on our call for state leaders to create a Marshall Plan for education and urge them to focus on 6 key areas, which I'll highlight in my presentation today, as well as renew urgency around topics like early literacy and educator talent, which we know are key levers for educational improvement. We also include updates to the metrics that we track annually on Michigan's progress and performance towards becoming a top 10 education state. So I'll begin with the first area, which is fair investment. And we know that historically, the state of Michigan has drastically underfunded much needed support for students with additional needs. And that includes students from low income backgrounds, as well as English learners and students with disabilities. So after months of distance learning and the anticipated learning loss we expect to see, the need to invest in Michigan's vulnerable students is even greater. In our report, we recommend that state leaders prioritize education and especially the needs of vulnerable students in the budget decisions they make this year, both through immediate investments like closing the digital divide and supporting students in their transition to post-secondary learning if that's been disrupted, providing no-cost, high-quality voluntary summer school programs and expanding efforts to attract and retain educators, but also committing to the long-term changes that will be needed to make Michigan's school funding system much more equitable. As shown in the graph here, Michigan is among the worst states in the nation for equitable funding. It's actually one of only 16 states that provides less funding to high poverty schools than low poverty schools. And we know that prioritizing equity must happen. And that includes if there's a budget deficit. So while Michigan has historically made budget cuts across all students, regardless of their need, we know that other more equitable approaches are possible. And in our report, we highlight an example of that in Ohio, where their Republican government and governor and legislature structured cuts in a way that students with the greatest needs would actually have the smallest decreases. In our next area, we highlight honest information, transparency, and reporting. Providing education stakeholders, including students and families and educators and policymakers, with honest information, transparency, and public reporting should always be a top priority. And these systems are really foundational to strong and effective improvement efforts, especially because they can shine a light on the gaps that we often see in resources and effectiveness that disproportionately impact our vulnerable students. Amid the COVID-19 crisis, these systems are just as important, if not more, and are really needed to ensure that all students, especially vulnerable students, are receiving the supports that they need to succeed. In our report, we call on Michigan to improve efforts around data collection and reporting, including efforts to find and re-engage the missing and chronically absent students in our state. We also highlight Phoenix Union High School District in Arizona, and this district has developed a plan to call every single student every day in order to check in on their well-being, and that's both socio-emotionally and in terms of other supports like access to food and technology and other needs. And then they compile this information into a common database in the district so that school personnel can quickly identify which students need which supports. And we'd like to see more efforts like that in Michigan. Our next area is extended and expanded learning time. As Maura mentioned earlier, an overwhelming percentage of parents in the poll, 83%, said that the state should provide safe, free, and voluntary in-person summer school to help students really catch up from the learning loss that they may be experiencing. And we know that research shows that this kind of high-quality, voluntary, multi-week summer school can lead to notable gains in reading and in math. And that other forms of extended and expanded learning time, like high dosage tutoring, have really clear benefits as well. So we recommend that state leaders invest in these strategies now so that districts can begin the planning process now to really offer these supports to students, and especially vulnerable students, starting this summer, but for the next several years as well. We know that it will take a long time to recover from the learning loss that we are anticipating and starting to see. Our next area is quality virtual instruction. And due to public health guidance, distance learning has been at least a part, if not the entirety, of most student schooling during the pandemic. In fact, only 1% of school districts in our state plan to offer only full-time instruction in December, and that was down from 3% in November of 2020. We also know that despite the efforts of districts and philanthropy and business leaders and parents, a digital divide persists, and that's blocking access to learning for many of our students. So we call on state leaders to provide coordination, research, and every tool in their tool belt to ensure that every child has a dedicated device, high-speed internet, and native language support. As we also know that students in rural and urban areas, students of color, and as you can see on the graph here, students from low-income households are the most impacted by Michigan's digital divide. Our fifth area is inclusivity and socio-emotional supports. We know that COVID-19 has really exposed the many realities of the non-academic needs that schools are called to meet. And from health services to food security, the March closures of schools really created a wide range of crises in our communities. So we commend the state's efforts to ensure that food security, despite closures, has been a priority through innovative programs like Pandemic EBT. Michigan actually became a national model for this program by eliminating paperwork requirements and coordinating agencies, and was able to rapidly provide pandemic food assistance to about 900,000 students. We also then recommend an increased focus on student socio-emotional well-being and providing training and resources to educators to make sure that they're well prepared to foster an inclusive classroom environment, whether that's in person or virtually. Our final area is transitions to post-secondary opportunities. And we know that for high school students who are preparing to enter post-secondary education, disruptions in learning due to COVID-19 can be particularly harmful and expensive for them. And that cost should not fall on the shoulders of Michigan students. So we recommend that state leaders prioritize funding to ensure that juniors and seniors who've been impacted by COVID-19 disruptions have access to no-cost remedial coursework at Michigan's community colleges. As you can see in the chart, the remediation rate for Michigan's poorest districts was over 2.5 times higher than the rate for the wealthiest districts in our state, and we can't afford to make it more difficult or more expensive or longer for students to earn a degree in accreditation. So we recognize that advancing these recommendations to bring about a stronger response to COVID-19 in our state and make progress towards Michigan becoming a top education state will take partnership and engagement. So we really appreciate you joining today and your interest in our work. We're very eager to answer your questions and hear your thoughts. And I'll turn it back over to Amber to facilitate that discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. And thank you, Maura, for sharing this really, really helpful and really compelling data with us today. As I mentioned before, we have two panelists with us this morning, both deeply respected leaders and voices for educational excellence and equity across our state. Alice Thompson is the CEO of Black Family Development Educational Services. She's also the chair of the NAACP Detroit Branch Education Committee and retired CEO of Black Family Development Incorporated, and a wonderful partner, and anyone knows her, a wonderful leader and voice for equity throughout Michigan. Mike Jandernoa, as I mentioned, is the founder and chairman of 42 North Partners in West Michigan. He's also a very respected civic and business leader, and he has really emerged as such an important voice for equity in state education conversations. So Alice, I would like to start with you. You have long worked to ensure a brighter future for students, especially children of color. And there are really strong indications, as we've discussed today, that the pandemic is worsening longstanding inequities in educational outcomes and opportunity. For you, what efforts should state leaders be prioritizing now to help our most vulnerable students across the state? And I think did we lose Alice? I hope not. This would be a very COVID-19 moment if we did.
I'm good. I was on mute, I think. Am I okay
now? Oh, there
now?
you are. Okay, thank you, Alice.
Well, thank you so much for your question. And thank you for the word prioritize now, because now speaks to the urgency of these issues. So thank you for that. Now, first, I think our leaders need to take this issue of educating children out of the political arena and view this issue of education as the most critical investment for our state. It's about the health and wellness and strength of our state. So we know this already, that well-educated children and all students is a foundation for a strong economy. Our economy in Michigan, more than ever before, is a knowledge economy. And so we must nurture that. Secondly, as a priority, our leaders must be well informed and educated on the issues of how to make this happen, to be a top state in education. Now, I say this honestly, and they can begin to educate themselves by reviewing and knowing about the tremendous work of Education Trust Midwest. Your information, your research, your data that you produce, your annual report, the wonderful, wonderful work of Opportunity for All campaign, the Marshall Plan, all of this work about equity needs to be known by our leaders because you can inform them. And so a well-educated, informed leader in our state can help to make things happen differently. And I would say a major priority right now, with much urgency, is for them to put a plan in place with robust funding about how they're going to address the learning loss that this pandemic has produced. Schools have been closed. We're doing online learning for our students, and all students need help, but a particular focus with courage and wisdom on the needs of children of color in underserved communities, both rural and urban, English language learners, and those with disabilities. We have to focus on that population because, as you've said before from research, they are the hardest hit and impacted by this pandemic. Overwhelmingly, they must focus on vulnerable children. And then I would also say that they have to reimagine our education system. And so some of the things I'm going to say are not popular, right? And I've had this view for 10 years. We have to rethink having our schools closed for 2 months in the summertime. If we're going to catch up on this learning loss, we must reimagine, have the courage to say we need to be in school perhaps 11 months out of the year, if not 11 and a half months. I'm saying that a 2-week vacation for the next 5 years may be enough for our students. Unpopular, of course, but this is not a new issue for me. We have to find ways to help capture the learning loss while at the same time taking our children to grade level proficiency. Because before the pandemic, they were already behind in many areas. And so these are bold steps that we have to take, but I'm encouraging folks to think about summer school as part of our school year. I am hopeful, Amber, that in 2021, that we will see our schools fully packed with students in the month of June, in the month of July, and perhaps half of August. We cannot overcome these losses by doing the same thing we've always done. We'll get the same kind of results. So I'm advocating for that. But the other issue they have to do is this. They have to focus on developing standards for online learning. I don't think we have any. And so this will not go away. I mean, I think that now based on the pandemic, we may still have ongoing online learning, especially for catching up and getting kids back on par where they should be and at proficiency and grade level. So they have to have some standards for that. And they have to focus on preparing our teachers and our parents and students for what I'm going to call digital literacy, which in many schools we lack when the pandemic broke out. They must focus on that. And so I've talked to a few colleagues over the last few days who gave me some more information. So we all know Detroit Parent Network, met a little, and she said, you know, Alice, we need to talk about really going forward, looking at in the spaces and places where needed to have clinics, more and more health clinics, because it's about a combination of health and education, not two separate tracks, right? And so I think our leaders must have the courage to begin to reimagine what they must do to help our children not only gain losses, but achieve grade level proficiency. It takes courage, it takes reimagination, it takes education. And I think that EdTrust is a nice place to go to be educated on what needs to happen. So those are my recommendations for our state leaders right now.
Thank you so much, Alice. I'm gonna turn to Mike, but I just want to pause for a second. We do have questions coming in from guests and participants. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to turn to those questions in just a second, but we welcome you. Please do send them your way. First, Mike, I want to ask you a question. Mike, you have been engaged in state level education policy conversations now for many years. Oftentimes we hear the argument that the state shouldn't throw more money at education, at the challenge that we have. And while we know that money alone is not sufficient to really move outcomes for all children, We also know that the research shows that money matters, especially for children who live in poverty and children who face multiple barriers to learning. So from your perspective, what do you think state leaders should consider now, really in the coming weeks and months, in terms of funding to address the inequities that Alice isn't highlighting today? And as well as that matter in the long run, both in the immediate moment and then looking out.
Sure, thank you, Amber. And I agree with the comment that Alice made about just throwing more money at it and doing the same old thing isn't going to fix the problem. If we continue to do the same old thing, we're going to get the same poor results. So we do need change, and we do need to invest, and we're going to need to invest more money in education. There's no question about that. So, but there's some things that we can do, as has been mentioned today already, and that don't require money. And that's having the governor and the leaders of the House and Senate, Republican and Democrats, be very forceful in advocating to bring the students back to face-to-face learning in K-12. It's so important. So, and then beside that, as Alice said, I agree with her wholeheartedly. This needs to be a bipartisan effort to invest more in our K-12 system, and we need to do that. And I would start right now with the commitment to a summer school program. And we need that summer school program to be extensive and comprehensive for these kids who've had so much regression. Last year, the end of 2020, and now as we're starting into the 2021 school year in January, the regression so far. So that's 2 years in a row. And then beyond that, we need the year-round, what they call the balanced calendar. I agree with Alice's comments wholeheartedly. It's time. Other countries around the world have done it very successfully, and Michigan needs to catch up. The second piece on the investment would be in the federal CARES Act dollars, and those can be moved a little bit more easily. The governor has some dollars that she can allocate, and we strongly advise from the business community that they be focused on an equity basis, as well as the MDE will have some money and decisions, and they can, again, and we believe strongly that should be focused on an equity basis for at-risk kids. So the next piece that I would say would be the remedial education program that was mentioned by Mary and Maura, in terms of looking at those juniors and seniors who've been affected the last 2 years in high school, that they need that remedial educational support in the summer, that, again, paid by the state. The fourth thing I'd say would be the Guidehouse report, which has taken this administrative dollars and take them out of administration and putting them into the classroom for the kids. There's $800 million there that's been identified that should be moved from administrative expenses. And when it goes to the at-risk kids, it's going to be focused not 100%, but mainly on those Black and brown kids who need that help. They need to be put in a position to catch up from the regression they've suffered over the last 2 years. And then I'd say the other aspect of a bipartisan insistence on testing and assessments. It's so important to help the teachers be effective, that they know exactly where their students are, and that districts know where their students are, so they can help those students catch up. So obviously really important to get that started. But once we get that in place and in motion, we're going to have to continue that process on a longer term basis, especially with year-round schooling.
Thank you so much, Mike. We have a question from a West Michigan leader. Have you assessed how many districts where there were disproportionate numbers of children of color participating in full-time online learning were also districts with high COVID-19 penetration? We don't know that number, but our data team is seeing if they can locate that data during the conversation today. And if we cannot do it during the conversation, then we'll try to follow up with you by email. So help us make sure that we have your email address. And we have a question for Alice. Just over a third of all parents rate remote learning as successful or extremely successful. From your work on the ground and what you're hearing from parents in Detroit, what help do parents need now to help their children with learning now? Alice, you're on mute.
Great question. And I was going to respond to that because in the space that I'm in, and I can't speak for the whole city or for all parents, but the space that I'm in, I've seen the results from the polling that was done by EdTrust. And also I have talked to colleagues directly. I have called leaders who are running schools. I have called agencies servicing parents. And so what they have said to me is this: there are still some kids who do not have devices. They do not have them. There's still kids who are working from packages still. And that's not any fault of their own. There are still those who have digital divide, right? And so the parents are saying to us, they appreciate their school's effort because interestingly, parents are tied to their school. They are loyal to their school, but they are saying that they feel that things are inadequate. They do not feel comfortable with what's happening with their children. The parents I've spoken to in our survey said they know that face-to-face is better. So the 1/3 saying it's working is not my experience, right? They appreciate it, but there are so many other factors that impact what's happening with them. For example, in their households, their children may not have their own bedroom and desk. So the online conversations, whether it's by phone or on remote, is sharing with the whole household, with the television, with the cooking, with the cleaning. And so there's not much private space for many of those that we work with, not all, of course. And so the online learning has not been the best operation, although they appreciate the efforts that are going on. But many of them feel that their children are not getting what they like them to get. And they're feeling as parents overwhelmed. If you have a child in kindergarten, in 3rd grade and 4th grade, you need the parent to be a co-educator with you. And they're saying, I don't have the capacity. In many ways, I don't know how to deal with a kindergarten, a 3rd and 5th grader. When in our schools, we have teachers focused on all those issues. So to answer your question, in my experience, our parents appreciate the efforts, but it's not enough, and they feel overwhelmed.
Thank you, Alice. It's heartbreaking to hear how many students still don't have devices, or any device, much less a device for every child in the home, which as a mom doing virtual schooling, as this happens today right now, we know are very much needed to make virtual schooling successful and working at home successful. We have a follow-up question from a veteran educator in the city of Detroit. I appreciate what Alice is saying about the extending the learning year. Can you please talk about how funding could be used to do this without overburdening classroom teachers?
I will try. That's a very good question. So in my remarks, I'm saying this, that with this occurring, you have to have robust funding for it. A school budget right now cannot support what I'm supporting, what I'm advocating for. I'm saying to our state leaders that you must invest the kind of dollars into this to make it happen. And so clearly your school budget will not do it. You need other additional funding to make it happen. It must be attractive and appealing for your staff and for students and parents. But I'm talking about an infusion of tremendous dollars that can create an exciting summertime program for them, but not with your present school funding. It cannot occur.
It's such a great point, Alice. And if I may, I'd like to add, one of the reasons in the report that we highlight making high dosage tutoring and summer school available for all families who would like it, just to make it optional and free, so that that teachers that may not be able to do that because of family or other kinds of obligations can opt to do that. We also need, as Alice is saying, we also need to invest in it. It needs to be appealing for educators to want to do that. If you can make more money painting in your neighborhood than you can teaching, which is a huge problem and a longstanding problem in terms of underpay, especially for teachers in high poverty districts, then it just is not it does become a burden, and so we have to make sure that we do it in a way that really incentivizes high quality teaching and learning, and not a mandatory obligation, right?
Amber, may I add this too? One
Yeah.
of the things I thought about too, besides the summer school, and some schools have this, is really in those needed areas where we know that kids really, really have tremendous learning loss.
Yeah.
That we think about even funding what I'm going to call Saturday academies. So we have to have school where it's more than just the usual, Monday through Friday, 8 to 3 o'clock. But we got to think about perhaps exciting things on Saturday that can happen that will want a child to come to school to learn more. Some teacher to come on a Saturday. But again, you have to have, exciting funding and things to happen to make that work. Not the same old, but something very exciting, very new that would be intriguing for our staff and for our students and parents.
We have a question, another follow-up question. How do you think we should account for students that have traditionally balked at summer school opportunities, an extended year? That is, what happens if we offer all these summer opportunities and students do not access them? And if I may, I'd love to respond to that partly with my professional role and partly with my mom hat on. So I'm a big believer in summertime learning. I'm Latina. My daughter, we're raising her to be bilingual, and summertime is a great opportunity for us to get all kinds of high dosage tutoring in, whether it's in Spanish or it's in other languages. We're big believers in multilingualism, or in things that she may need to be caught up in, like in reading last summer. So but we try to do that in a way that's fun, so that she's getting a good 4 or 5 hours of that kind of daily instruction, but then she's also having a lot of fun. So she wants to do it again the next day because she's 8 years old and she should have fun during the summer. So that's one way. The other thing is that, we're talking about if folks don't access them. I think the polling was so important. Again, like, it was so interesting to me that more than 80% of parents said that they would like to access free optional. And it does feel, I think it feels different for folks when something's optional rather than mandatory and they're being made to do it, that they have the option to do it, and it's attractive and it's high quality. I think those things can be powerful attractors to this kind of extended year. Alice, what would you like to add to, and Mike, please jump in as well.
Well, thank you for that. And that's a very good question that was raised because it is a problem. But here's the concept. Let's think about our schools as schools without walls. They need not be in the regular school building. Why not make a summer academy where you get in a bus and go learn something about agriculture, learn something about zoology, learn something about space. Kids really are thirsty for learning. Our problem is we're making it boring for them. So you've got to make summer school exciting. It's not about that hard brick wall. It's about thinking and reimagining a school without walls, and call it kids love field trips, right? And so every experience is a field trip full of learning. And so that's how you get kids excited, that you excite them, you inspire them. But let's think about schools without walls. I mean, how many kids don't want to go on a field trip, right? It's about learning. There's so much to explore in Michigan, so much to learn about our state. Let's use it. Let's not do the same old thing, because kids will find Saturday and summer boring unless we make it exciting. And we can make it exciting, Amber.
Thank you, Alice. I'm excited listening to you.
Yeah, Alice, I agree with you that we can do it outside the school walls. And
yes.
You could do that with a 2-week summer camp.
Yes.
We are a big sponsor of a summer camp where you've got the academics in the morning and all the other camp activities in the afternoon, swimming and hiking, etc. So We've got lots of museums around the state of Michigan that can be interesting and exciting to learn about the history or learn about the growth and the businesses in our community. So there are other ways to create interest and so forth in the summer program that can be keep that interest higher.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mike.
And I would just add one more thing based on the polling. I think if you see half of parents who don't feel like they have enough information about how their kid is doing, communicate with parents, communicate with them early so that they can plan ahead for summer school once they know how their kid is going. I think that would be really helpful as well, purely as my perspective as a pollster.
And knowing if your child is behind grade level expectations, right? Great point, Maura. Mike, I want to, we've talked a lot about extended year, and I want to pivot to a little broader lens. As a business leader in Michigan, we know that the success of our students and our future workforce is essential to the state's future. What, beyond the extended year, what do you believe a state educational recovery plan should entail? Well,
this is a very good question because talent has been the biggest issue for years in the business community. In fact, one of the business groups that I've been involved with in West Michigan, Talent 2025, was founded 10 years ago to address the demographic challenge when 1 million people left between 2000 and 2009. We said we're going to need a really well-educated group of students because we don't have enough students in the population to replace the baby boomers. So now that COVID's come, it's made that gap significantly worse and a bigger challenge. And as Alice was mentioning earlier, we're moving to a knowledge-based work environment. And the requirements that these students are going to have is going to be at least a 2-year community college type degree or an apprenticeship. But it's just the high school education itself will not provide a career and a job track for them. So it's really important. I think that because of that, as I mentioned earlier, it's essential that we plan this robust remedial program for this summer for the recent graduates, for the juniors and seniors. That we're going to have to continue doing that for a few years because of that impact on the sophomores and freshmen as well. So that program is going to have to be growing dramatically. From a long-term standpoint, we've got to get back to our 3rd grade reading idea that we need to help these kids grow and develop so that they can read by the time they finish the 3rd grade and go in the 4th grade, because from the 4th grade on, they're expected to read to learn. And so we've got to get back at that. And there's so many of these at-risk kids who before the COVID were 1 year to 2 years behind, 2.5 years behind. Now with COVID, they're that and more, and there's more kids that are in that thing. So from a long-term standpoint, we've got to help these kids learn to read and be in that position of making that happen. So, and the other aspect that has to happen is we've got to change our lens of funding to an equity-based funding for these at-risk kids. As was pointed out by Mary in the slides, we are 46th. We can't get to a top 10 state in education unless we fix that gap. That gap is way too wide. So that commitment to equity for these students is an important transition. I mentioned that Guidehouse report could be a down payment, a good start with that 800 million. But we're going to need a lot more funding on an equity basis to move forward, because the other school students, even in the nicer schools, suburbs and so forth, have also been affected by their COVID impact on their education. So you're going to have to expand it in total in order to get us more competitive from an equity perspective.
Thank you, Mike. Great points about the near and the far, and not get lost in the immediate moment. Right. that we're in for sure. Alice, we've heard in the poll, that the vast majority of all parents, but especially African-American parents and parents of color, expressing concern about their child falling behind. 91% of Black parents and parents of color reported concerns, 83% of white parents. We also heard that parents aren't getting access to the information they need about their child's learning. What can state leaders do now in the coming weeks to address these challenges of information gap and transparency?
Yeah. You know, thank you for that, Mary. And when I read that, I did some calling to some peer groups to see what's going on. And so this is what I do know. I want to first focus on the school level responsibility. As I've talked to my peers about this in terms of parents need information, I said, are you still having parent-teacher conferences? Yes, we are. Are you still issuing report cards? Yes, we are. You giving progress reports? Yes, we are. Well, so there's something missing between the parents' perception and what the schools say they're doing. They're doing report cards, parent-teacher conferences. Are they still testing? They're required to do test, although not state tests, they're still testing. And so I think the issue with this is that the schools must be more in tune to the parents' perception versus their perception, right? And so first of all, it's a school task to inform parents. They're even required to post on their websites. Now they're required to do this, post on their website, the progress they're making in their return to school plan. They must do it every single month. They must go to their board every month on progress reports. But the missing piece here is perhaps the clear engagement of parents. So that's the school level piece that needs to be occurring. Now at the state level, the state can of course issue policies that can do some mandating of reporting, but they do have quite a few required reporting requirements now based upon the pandemic. They really do. Schools are required to post things. They're required to communicate with parents. And so perhaps we're falling short in that and do not know it. The other thing I would say too, and I'm not trying to rush this though, but again, we do need to have them begin to identify state leaders. When are we going to return to our regular state required testing, right? Because when we were doing that, that certainly gave the whole community good information about all of our schools. And so again, I would say that at our school level process, we have to close the gap on what we think we're doing and parents' perception of that. And so I think the school must be the one to close that gap first, and then the state level. So the state level piece can of course issue policy and procedure, but also let parents know at what point, and schools as well, are we going to return to our regular required state testing that must happen in our state.
Thank you, Alice. From our organization's perspective, we hope it will be this spring, simply because we can better direct resources and support to kids if they're behind, if we have that data. Mike, I'd like to close. If you can share just a few brief thoughts on what, as a state, what is it going to take to have the political will in our state to make sure that the needs of all kids are being met, and that you talked about pivoting toward an equity approach in the state. What do you think that will take?
Well, I think it's going to take the collaboration and the working between business groups and educators and foundations and so forth to prioritize this whole idea of exclusivity, to get that changed into be inclusive and inclusive from the standpoint of all kids. This year, this issue of racial inequity and racial justice has been thrown upon us, and it's a big topic, and the business community is trying to look at and address that. They want to be more inclusive, but in order to do that, we've got to give the opportunity to the Black and brown children to be well educated. It's not fair that they aren't given that opportunity of a quality education. So that's got to be a big piece of this, is prioritizing. Now that we know one of the root causes of the challenges in these school systems, we've got to make those changes to the equity lens and the equity format to give them that chance. So because that whole idea of needing more employees and more at the skilled level and at the college level, for the knowledge worker. It's incumbent upon the business community to share with the educators the real requirements and needs that these students are going to have so that they can have a good career, that they can be successful from an economic standpoint. So, and then I think we've got to have the voters start to speak out and raise their voice with all the candidates who are running for office or the elected officials, that education is their priority and that's the area that we need to increase our investment in. So we have to, as voters and parents, speak up. Our parents, our grandparents, they had to deal with the World War II and that challenge in their life. We as a society in our generation has got to deal with COVID. And with COVID, we've got to find that way to bring that Marshall Plan. And you guys started that concept, that idea last year, EdTrust, with the Marshall Plan. I think it's a great visualization of what needs to be done. We need to do things very differently, and we need to do it together for our kids because they're our future.
Yeah.
I couldn't say it any better, Mike. Thank you so much for your leadership and your commitment, and thank you for being with us today, Alice. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you to you as well for all of your leadership across so many different important topics in the state and your time today. I want to thank our team, which at EdTrust Midwest has worked so very hard. Global Strategy Group and Early Works in Detroit for all of their work and the data collection and the hundreds of conversations that we've had with parents in recent months. I just encourage you all to, if you'd like to take part in our Opportunity for All campaign. The hashtag is OPForAll, OPP for all. Our report is out on our website. And we really appreciate your time today. Happy New Year, and let's hope it's a much healthier and more positive new year than it was for last year. Thank you all for joining us today.